I want to welcome you to this 4-week course in which I introduce 4 great souls, namely Éliphas Lévi, Paracelsus, Franz Mesmer, and Jakob Böhme, and in which I explore their contribution to humanity in the dissemination of their teachings, which later appear in the teachings of Helena Blavatsky. I created this course because I believe it is important for those interested in theosophy to find out more about these great souls who are mentioned numerous times by H.B. Blavatsky in her writings, in what way they contributed to the teachings of the Theosophical Society, and what Blavatsky had to say about them. Understanding something of the challenges and difficulties these great souls went through might even help us for our personal inner growth. Because even though they were very remarkable, they had strengths and weaknesses which we face on our own personal path. And even advanced souls have anything but a uniform life on this earth. For example, Éliphas Lévi and Franz Mesmer were married but unhappily married. Paracelsus never married, and Jakob Böhme had a very loving and fulfilling relationship. Éliphas Lévi and Paracelsus and Jakob Böhme were poor, whereas Franz Mesmer was well off. I'm starting with Éliphas Lévi, the reason being that his concept of the astral light is extremely important for the things that I emphasize in Paracelsus and Franz Mesmer. When I do my research, it becomes clear to me that I try to find the true personality of the subject of my research. But they are always more than the biographical development. And of course, not only do I read the teachings, but also biographies. And some biographers are sympathetic or not overly sympathetic to the object of their research. And so I have to do this, synthesize this information. And I'm trying to always find the essence of the personality. And on top of it, for each one, I try to find a quality that speaks to me. So let's start with the terms, because I know that not everybody here is a member of the Theosophical Society. So I thought I would explain just the way I understand. Mystic is a seeker who by contemplation tries to obtain unity with divine. And occultism is the belief in the existence of secret, mysterious, or supernatural forces. And magic I see as consciously employing invisible powers to produce visible effects. Theosophy is an ancient wisdom. And in general, it's a teaching about God and the world based on mystical insight. But when we talk about the Theosophy of HBB, then it's the teachings of a modern movement originating in the US in 1875. And the founders were Blavatsky, Colonel Olcott, and William Judge. And that brings us to Éliphas Lévi Sahet. But that was not his real name. He was born as Alphonse Louis Constant. And he was also sometimes called Abbe Constant. So why should we as Theosophists try to find something out about Éliphas Lévi? First of all, H.B. Blavatsky mentions him often in her writings. And I found in an article in the Theosophist in 1881, she said he was the greatest Hermetic philosopher in Europe of the present century. And it's true, back then, during her time, he was read by many people who were interested in occultism. He was the one who introduced the major themes of the occult tradition as a whole. And when we find out more about him, he was a courageous person. And one of the quotes, I paraphrase it here, is something like, God never made a saint out of, God made a saint out of criminals often, but never of people who were cowardly or lukewarm. I love that. Still, the quality that spoke to me the most was his honesty. But he was not only honest to himself, he was true to himself. Because sometimes we are honest, but then we don't take the necessary steps. And that's what he did. And sometimes it wasn't easy. So who was he? Well, he was a French author, and the first books he wrote were actually more political. But later in his life, he became one of the most important esoteric writers of all time. He inspired a number of key esotericists. For example, Hoepfl, who was also once a Theosophist and the founder of the modern Marxist organization order, and for example, Aleister Crowley, and of course, Blavatsky. And he was the pioneer of modern occultism. He's very well known for his theory and history of magic, for the interpretation of the Kabbalah and the Tarot, and of the emblematic drawings like the Baphomet, which is his most famous drawing, I believe. And here we see on this slide a picture of him in 1836. So his early life. So he was born on February 8th, 1810 in Paris. And of course, as I mentioned, as Alphonse Louis Constant. Because he was born in February, this makes him an Aquarian. And the planet Uranus is very strong. And Aquarians are known for their idealism and humanitarianism. But under stress, they can become radicals. And Aquarians represent a vital spiritual power that renews and fertilizes self and humanity. Now, he was known as a clever lad. He was a little bit sickly when he was young, the first 7 years of his life. He didn't play much with his other kids. And there was a parish priest who really made sure that he got the best education he could at this young age. And at the age of 15, he went into a little seminary. And there he was taught by one of the abbes was Friar Colonna. And he talks about him later on his life. He was a very unusual, a little bit free-spirited abbe. He wasn't very dogmatic. And that caused problems with the higher ups. And then eventually he was removed. And one of the things that happened is all the kids that liked him or that had the courage to say it had to take their lunch kneeling down. After that, he decided to go to the seminary of Saint-Sulpice. Why? Well, he wanted to become a priest. That was his first goal. That's what his desire was, or he thought it was. And he learned Latin. He learned Greek. And he became a Hebrew scholar. And in 1836, he left the seminary shortly before his consecration. So what happened? Well, I think even before he was a certain event happened, he was had problems with the rigidity of the teachings, with the dogma. But then he was teaching girls. He was preparing them for the communion for 2 years. And one day, a mother brought her daughter, and she was very poor, and nobody wanted to teach her. And she asked him to take care of her. And there was something about this girl that caught his eye. She was like Madonna-like. And some of the articles or biographies I read said he might have had an affair, but I don't think so. And he wrote about this in his confessions later. He just realized that there was something inside of him, a struggle. And before his consecration, he went to the director of the seminary and talked to him about his inner struggle, and that made it impossible. Again, some biographers said there later on he was defrocked, but that wasn't true because he was never consecrated. So these were difficult years for him. So his father was a poor shoemaker and he had passed away, and his mother had been a very pious person all her life, and she taught Alphonse how to pray, and she was so happy when he decided to become a priest. And then when he decided against it, she was devastated and she committed suicide. and that weighed heavily on Alphonse. He had a circle of friends, young bohemians, a group of artists and socialists. They were all poor, but he was very, very creative. He was very talented. His drawings are really amazing. And so he was able to make a little bit of money. Now, if this slide maybe looks a little bit chaotic, I wanted to reflect this chaotic period. There's a lot of things that happened, and I just pulled out the most important things because it shows his inner struggle. So first he was a bohemian, but then he was unhappy and he wanted structure again. So at one point he went back to the Benedictine abbey of Solomon. But he wasn't very happy there, but at least they had a great library and he was able to read a lot of about mythology and maybe even already then about Swedenborg and about Paracelsus. Then eventually he got a teaching position in Julie, and as it happened there and in other places, he was loved by the students. But his colleagues were very jealous, and in the end, it didn't work out. I read at one point that he even joined the traveling theatre. That didn't work out. And there's one thing he learned. So he was very poor, and he lived in one of those hotels or motels that were very cheap. They were furnished. And he saw the passion and these little relationships between woman and man, and, fights and jealousy. And so he got a much better feeling of about humanity and the human beings than he would have gotten if he would have become a priest. Anyhow, eventually he sat down and he wrote a book, which led to his first arrest. It's the Bible of Freedom. So it was an extravagant mixture of socialist, mystical, romantic, and feminist ideas. So he was a feminist in some ways. He had a really nice, maybe sometimes even naive opinion of women. Some biographers said, but he was deeply religious. But he had really problems with what was happening in the society and what the church was doing. Well, this did not go over well. And supposedly he even got offered money not to publish it. And it was confiscated right away. But of course, some copies made it out. He didn't have a lawyer. He was too poor, and he defended himself, but nobody understood what he was saying. And he became famous through the trial. Oh, he distinguished himself as one of the most sensational representatives of Christian revolutionary socialism. Florence Tristan was she was a socialist. She was politically active, and she was well off. She also was an author, and she befriended him. And luckily, he was convicted to, I think, 300 franc and 8 months in prison. And it was a difficult situation. And he didn't have any money, but she supported him. So the situation would get a little bit easier. But the interesting thing is, as soon as there were rumors that, hey, they had an affair after he was released, he just stopped staying friends with her openly. So again, he had some other ways of income, but he was always extremely poor and close to starvation. And so he painted some murals, and he asked the archbishop if he could help him. And so he sent him to Évry. And that was like in a suburb of Paris. And he said, but you cannot teach using your real name. You have to use your mother's maiden name. And again, what happened? He went there. The community loved him. He did more and more sermons. And it didn't last long because eventually a newspaper figured out who he really was. And he had to leave that. And then again, he did a lot of illustrations, supposedly also for the author Dumas. And he wrote some little books. One of them was The Rose Tree of May, where he shared view about the women, and it was legends of, uh, Madonna-like figures. Let's put it that way. Um, so the personal life, during that time also probably one of the worst things that happened or that he did, not a lot of things happened to him, but he did. He seduced an assistant head mistress, and her name was Virginie, and she got pregnant. But during the same time, there was this student of his. Her name was Naomi Cadio, and she fell completely in love with Alphonse. And what she decided to do is she just this is what I found out later on, because some biographies didn't go into detail. But she basically stood in front of his door and said, "I'm not leaving." And then she was only 17 years old, and then her father said, "Well, you have to marry her." Now he was 36 and she was 17, but they got married. And Eugenie was very upset, and he would have liked to be involved in the upbringing of the child, but she did not allow it. But luckily, his son, it was a son, he had no problems with his father and liked him in the end. Unfortunately, the marriage was a disaster. During that time, he continued to be a radical socialist. And he wrote a pamphlet in 1847. It was called La Voix de la Famine. So it was the voice of famine. And it was considered an incitement to class fear. And so that led to the second imprisonment. And he was convicted to a year and was supposed to pay 1,000 francs. Now, that was the time when his wife was pregnant, and she wrote letters and begged authorities to release him earlier, which in the end happened. And then he continued with his revolutionary approach. He presided over the Club de Montagne, which was one of the most radical clubs. And then he wrote another book in 1848. So not only for him, for all the socialists. So when he was in prison the first time, of course, he was in prison with a lot of not only criminals, but also with a lot of other socialists. And for them, when they were at the beginning very enthusiastic about Louis Napoleon, but then he was disappointed. And again, he turned against the repressive emperor with a highly polemical chanson, which led to the third political imprisonment. I never could find out much about it, but in one biography, it was said that Louis Napoleon actually pardoned him, and so he was released probably very quickly. After that, he kept a low profile, but he did not abandon his political stance. During that time, so around 1852, which might have been very important, I think, is he met Bronsky. He was a Polish metaphysician. And Lévi, he was still Alphonse Constant. He was really influenced and inspired by his doctrine of messianism. That's what it's called. It was like a synthesis of philosophy, religion, science, and politics, a strange amalgam of esoteric philosophy, utopianism, and revealed religion. And we could see from what we heard up till now that he had this inner struggle. And Vronsky, he was able to reconcile a number of opposing elements in Constant's thinking. So he was a staunch Christian, but he also was a socialist, which caused conflicts. He was a rationalist, but he was also a mystic. And suddenly there were big changes. First of all, the death of Vronsky. He died. I think they hadn't known each other very long. And his wife left him. And they had together also a child. So it was a girl. And she was around 7 years old when she died. There are some letters that are still available. And in those, Alphonse has said that Naomi was not a very good mother. He also had failed the political ambitions. He had run for office, and he escaped an assassination attempt. Why? Well, there was a wine merchant who looked like him, and he got shot instead. So he decided against this. And then he wrote this magnum opus, Dogma and Ritual of High Magic. And that's when he used his pen name. And that's when he started to write as Éliphas Lévi Sahib. So why the name? Most biographies I have said that it's some kind of translation of into Hebrew of his name. But I it's a Rosicrucian source. It's German, and their interpretation was that maybe El is a very often used for God, and Levi implies Judaism, and Sahed imply there was a well-known Sufi scholar with that name, and it was just like he wanted to represent and pull together all three religions. I have no idea, and nobody really knows what had happened. But in some ways, it would make sense because for him, the true philosopher's stone was always a unity of all religions. Biographers have different opinions. Is it a new identity, or did he just change his name and the writings and this approach were the same? One thing was in his book that he wrote in 48, about the Testament about freedom. So he writes here, now our social work is finished. We ask neither indulgence nor severity with respect to it. We wrote according to the dictates of our heart and our intelligence. We have fulfilled a duty and find sufficient recompense in that fact. So it seems as he was realizing that there was no way he could change the church or that he could change society. And that he thought maybe he can show individual men the way to enlightenment. But it's anybody's guess and personal interpretation how they look at it. So the works most influential, the works that he wrote were Dogma and Ritual of High Magic. That's his first work and probably his best. And then History of Magic and the Key of the Mysteries. And in History of Magic and the Key of the Mysteries, he did not really introduce new ideas. But he was a little bit more lax in his writing in the Key of the Mysteries and shared some anecdotes. And the main ideas that are important, so there were several ideas, but that are important for us as Theosophists, is the doctrine of the Astral Light and the application of the Hebrew alphabet to the tarot trumps and their placing on the Kabbalist tree of life, which is less important for Theosophists, but in general, these are the ideas he's known for. In the late 1850s, it's karma. Seems like he's found himself because he was true to himself. He had really happy years. He contributed poetry and articles on the Kabbalah to a French magazine. And he was well established as occultist. First, his trial and then his books have made him famous, and people were looking for him and they wanted to have him as a teacher. And he really had an affectional circle of friends and students. He spent most of his time in Paris, but he did travel to London, I think twice. But the first trip is the one that's better known. First of all, he made friends there, and one being Bulwer Lytton, who was an author. And a lot of articles were written about this invocation of the ghost of Apollonius of Tyana. So he only did one invocation, and he describes it in his first book. So anybody who's interested in finding out more details about it. But in short, there was a woman She was all in black. She approached him, there was in a carriage, and she said, I want you to do the invocation of the ghost of Apollonius of Tyana, and I want you to ask him a question. And she said, I will pay you for all the paraphernalia because you need a lot of things for these kind of ceremonies. And I think he prepared for several weeks, 3 weeks or so, and he did it. And it was the first and the last time. He never did an invocation again. He asked a personal question too. It seems that he got the answer. He was never allowed to reveal who this woman was. My assumption is the way it's all described, that she was Rosicrucian. And it was an unusual experience. But he used a sword, right, to keep off bad spirits. I think he was very wary about that. And he became numb in his arms, and that lasted for some time. In general, see, back then, spiritualism was active, and the socialists were interested in it. But he was really against it. And he always said it. And he also said there's a huge difference between sorcery and between magic. So let's just look a little bit about his teaching style. So Spadalieri was a devoted student of his, 13 years. And there are lots of letters. And actually, Spadalieri gave to the Ask the Theosophist, which was a magazine published back in 1881, I think it was then, to publish some of the letters. And just so I wouldn't forget, I put that down. One of the basic admonition of Lévi was know, dare, will, and keep silence. And the silence was, it seems to me, I read in the Mahatma letters that I was surprised. Cage said that he was actually taught by Rosicrucians. And I have listened to a German presentation by a Rosicrucian woman, and she mentioned the Rosicrucian influence. So, and that might refer to the keep silence, that there are certain things you cannot reveal. Anyhow, he wrote in this letter, I seek to maintain a great calmness of mind and cleanliness of body. A well-ventilated and dry apartment of even temperature, yet more cold than warm. An apartment with nothing out of place and in which nothing calls to mind the grosser needs of life. My food is simple and substantial. I leave my work before I become overly tired. I take moderate, helpful exercise. I take particular care never to become overexcited or too fatigued in the evening, so that the greatest calm may precede sleep. Everyone is good to me. When I pass by, children smile at me. My little cell never sees any but the kindest faces. Everything breathes an atmosphere of deep peace. And the earth would be an Eden for me if my brothers were not suffering in it. I think this letter tells a lot. He continues and writes a little bit about his way of teaching. As regards our lessons, I have no manuscript course. I give to my disciples according to the need of their minds what the Spirit gives me for them. I demand nothing, and I refuse nothing from them in return. It is a communion and an exchange of bread, spiritual for bodily. But the needs of the body are of so little account for me that the generous gifts of those of my children and brothers who are rich serve mainly to satisfy the first and greatest need of my soul and of all our souls, charity. Here we have this charity again. I love this way of teaching that the charity, when I read this, it reminds me that, that's was something that as a socialist was important to him. And so there is some of the socialist streak continue in his occult writing or approach. So in his last year, he was very poor. I mean, as he said, he never requested anything from the students and took what they gave him. He never even went out to look for students. It was really amazing. And he was ill. He had devoted followers, luckily. But in 1875, he developed dropsy and gangrene. And the friends that were around him when he died, or during the last days, he said he had till the last moment courage and mental clarity. He passed away on May 31st, 1875. And there's another interesting story with it. So he lived in Paris. He never, the last years, he always stayed the same place unless he had to move. And I think that happened only 3 times. And students or people who wanted something from him could show up. And one day, somebody knocked on his door. And he said to him, well, the number 5 is very important in your life. And you are going to die in 1875. And that's exactly what happened. As I said, he traveled twice to London and once to Germany. And the reason was that, the upheaval, the political situation was very stressful. And he was so poor, he really did have nothing. And so Mary Gebhardt was a student of his, and she invited him to come to Germany. Now, Mary Gebhardt after his passing, became a Theosophist. And if you want to find out more about her, you can find information on the Theosophical wiki, and this is where the photo is from. She said, I found in him what I have never met in any other individual since: a profound knowledge on occult subjects. I believe there was not a book on mysticism that he had not read. He had a wonderful memory and a marvelous flow of language. His expressions and illustrations being of the choicest and rarest character. One could sit for hours listening to his eloquent discourses on the occult side of nature. With all these wonderful gifts, he combined a benevolent, noble, and truthful nature. Never did I leave his presence without feeling that my own nature had been uplifted to nobler and better things. And I look upon Éliphas Lévi as one of the truest friends I ever had, for he taught me the highest truths, which is in the power of man or woman to grasp. What a lovely dedication. And there are other people who wrote, like there was a diplomat, Mrs. Hutchison, she wrote also very nicely about him. This brings me to Éliphas Lévi and Theosophy. So, supposedly, according to one Theosophist, HPB, which is the short form for Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, mentioned him 33 times in Isis Unveiled. And she also mentions him often in the Secret Doctrine, and especially often in Stanza 7, Shloka 5 in Volume 1, because this has to do with the Astral Light. She said the late Éliphas Lévi was the most learned Kabbalist and occultist of our age. And everything from his pen is precious to us, insofar as it helps to compare notes with the Eastern occult doctrines, and by the light thrown upon both to prove to the world that the two systems are one in their principal metaphysical tenets. And she also said, he was one of the cleverest, most learned, and interesting of writers. Now, in the Mahatma letters, Master K.H., I did not find any letters by Master Moria. He wrote several times about Éliphas Lévi. The reason being that Synod, and the correspondence was between K.H. and the Synod, had questions. And there was another gentleman called Hume. Because I guess they read his first book, Theory and Ritual of Magic. And he said, well, of course you don't understand everything because it was never meant for an initiated reader. And that's when he said, as I mentioned before, that a lot that he learned was from the Rosicrucians, which I have not found in any single biography. I only found it in the Mahatma letters. Even though HBB really admired him, mentions him, quotes him often, she criticized him too. She said he was rather too rhapsodically rhetorical to be sufficiently clear to the beginner. Which is true because it's not easy to read. Not everything, but I mean, some parts are not easy to read. And the philosophy which Éliphas Lévi gives out as Kabbalistic is simply mystical Roman Catholicism adapted to the Christian Kabbalah. And one of the things she said, and this is true because he was a devout Catholic till the end, though personally we are far from agreeing with all his opinions, for having been a priest, Éliphas Lévi could never rid himself to his last day of a certain theological bias. If we look, before we go to the specific topics that I wanted to address in his books, as the overall assessment. First of all, the French word occultism has been popularized first by Éliphas Lévi before appearing in any in other languages. And the writings by Lévi gave direction to the writings by H.P.B. Blavatsky. There is no doubt about that. The generation of occultists that followed him regarded him as its guide and master. And one important thing is he changed the popular concept of magic. Instead, as a means of manipulating forces of nature, he emphasized that drawing the will through certain channels and turning the magician into a more fully realized human being is the key. So it's not just manipulating forces. It has something to do with the will, but not with the will of the personality, the personal will. It has to do with the divine will. So that we have to give a chance to get the divine will to come through. As I mentioned, the Astral Light and connecting the Kabbalah with the Tarot were main ideas. But his courage, his honesty, his warmth, his compassion and teachings endeared him to his pupils. And the only criticism that I found by biographers, they said he was such a wonderful person, is this black spot where he left Eugenie, I don't know exactly how you say the name, or maybe Eugenie when she was pregnant. So let's go to the Astral Light. And I'm going to first read what he says about it, because the Astral Light is a very, very important concept. There exists in nature a force infinitely exceeding that of steam, a force that would enable the man capable of seizing and directing it to change the face of the world. The ancients knew this force. It consists in a universal agent whose supreme law is equilibrium and whose direction is directly related to the great arcanum of transcendental magic. Through the use of this agent, one can change the very order of the season, produce the phenomenon of day in the middle of the night, enter instantaneously into contact with the farthest end of the earth, see events on the other side of the world as Apollonius did, heal or attack at a distance, and confer in one's speech universal success and influence. And he mentions Mesmer, and he said, the Asian barely glimpsed by the groping disciples of Mesmer is nothing other than the first matter of the great work of the medieval adepts. And the Astral Light is very important to understand, not only because of Lévi, but because of Paracelsus and Mesmer. So in his different writings, he said, it was created when God uttered the word, let there be light. It is a surrounding fluid that penetrates all things. It is indifferent in itself. And he says the whole secret of magical operations consists in learning to control the astral light. It is also the universal record keeper. And it is a force that permeates the whole universe and can be harnessed for magic. He also explains that each individual possesses an astral body. It's an intermediary between body and soul. And if somebody knows, I mean, sometimes people can maybe live in the astral body and they don't know what they're doing, which wouldn't be good. But if you are an advanced soul and you know how to do it, you can leave the physical body and travel. Again, there's a synthesis of information, and it was discovered before Lévi. I mean, he says that openly in his book. I'm not the one. And I don't know, maybe it should be this quotation marks, right? The ancients knew the force. We know about odic force, or Od, discovered by the German Baron Karl von Reichenbach in 1854. Animal magnetism, also known as mesmerism, is an invisible natural force discovered, again, under quotation marks, by the German Dr. Franz Anton Mesmer. The Astral Light mentioned by Paracelsus. And Cornelius Agrippa from Nosheim, if you start reading certain paragraphs, you just know that he's talking about the same thing. And, Blavatsky in Isis Unveiled gives different, even more examples, and says that was like the Greek archaeos. So it's not new, it's just he wrote about it and he explained it. Now, in Theosophy, we make a distinction between Akasha and Astral Light. And this is important because he only uses the word Astral Light, Lévi, in his writings. But he doesn't always mean Astral Light the way we understand it. Sometimes he talks about the purity and then it's Akasha, but when he talks about, the demonic forces, he talks about the Astral Light. So he says it's the subtle supersensuous spiritual essence which pervades all space. And we in Theosophy, we say Akasha is seen as the spiritual primordial substance that pervades the whole space and from which the cosmos is developed. Now, the Astral Light is the invisible region that surrounds our globe, as it does every other. And most of us have heard of aura, which is, different level. It's this also the Astral Light. Now, Lévi calls it, in some places, magnetic breath. And this Astral Light can be modified by our acts, by our thoughts, and by health. We have to remember that thoughts pollute the Astral Light. In the end, it's the storehouse of all human and especially psychic iniquities. And I don't know, maybe it was Leadbeater, I can't remember who said, it's the dregs of Akasha. And the Astral Light can be used, good and evil. So let's look at the planes so we get a better picture, because again, this will be important for Paracelsus and for Mesmer. So we have in the Theosophical teachings 7 principles. We have the physical body, and then the etheric or the astral double. And then we have the life force, the desire body, the mind, the lower, the higher, and the higher mind, then Buddhi, the spiritual soul, and then Atma, the universal spirit. And here are the planes. So the objective plane is the physical body. And the astral is at the same level as the linga sharira, the astral double or the etheric double. But the akasha is much higher, much purer. It's at the level of manas, mind, the lower and higher mind, I would say. Just to reiterate, so the astral light is a medium which permeates everything and connects the soul with the body. And the astral light, which is poured down at the moment of conception, adjusts to the soul at contact and represents its first shell, even before the physical body is developed. The astral light also explains the influence of the planets at birth because it carries along the influence at this crucial moment. This is extremely important to remember. As Éliphas Lévi said, it's a record keeper too, but we know it usually as Akashic records. But again, I just want to reiterate it because it's so important to understand this difference. Sometimes this is called the memory of nature. And the subtle matter that composes the different planes of the cosmos has the ability to receive and record impressions of everything that happens on the terrestrial plane. But these records, which can be seen by some clairvoyants, exist on several planes. The records on the astral plane or astral light are said to be fragmentary and unreliable. The ones preserved on the mental plane, so more difficult to access, are said to be accurate. Only these are the true Akashic records. These are the things that we have to remember, especially when we go somewhere for advice. What plane is the person that helps us able to reach? So the next important thing that he writes about is the correspondence and analogy, which is extremely important also in occultism. So the natural world, as we know, is a vast system of correspondence and analogy. And natural phenomena not only correspond among themselves, but also with the invisible superior world. So he never doubted, and he always went in accordance with the great Hermetic axiom, quod superius, quod inferius. As above, so below. And it's the study of this universal law of analogy which makes the life work of the max. The analogies, that's what's very important. During his chaotic years, where he had this inner struggle, he read Swedenborg, and actually, and there is also information on the wiki about Swedenborg if you want to read about it. Very interesting person too. He talked a lot about correspondences, and he said that the Bible is written in a symbolic code. It's written that way to depict the truth about the spiritual worlds, but it's a code one of correspondences. It makes no sense to literally interpret the Bible. But he really studied and focused on the Kabbalah. And for him, within the system of the Sephiroth themselves, an endlessly complicated system of analogies and correspondences. And the Sephiroth are the 10 emanations through which Ein Sof, the infinite, reveals himself. Now, he found in its teaching a system linking the symbolism of various occult systems, which revealed the unity of all theosophies. So he studied deeply the Kabbalah, and then he studied Tarot. And for him, it was the Magus' own Rosetta Stone, the secret teachings of Hermes Trismegistus. He said that in 1799, a stone was unearthed which bore the same messages inscribed in hieroglyphic characters found in Egypt. And the translation opened the Egyptian past to the mind of modern men. So for him, it was the long lost key to occultism's hieroglyphs. It was that magical key for the correct understanding of every magical allegory and the informing doctrine of the Kabbalah. So what did he do? He connected the alphabet, the Hebrew alphabet, 22 letters, with the Tarot, the 22 major arcana of the Tarot. And he emphasized the importance of the symbolic value of numbers. Numbers are equivalent to letters. And the prophets often spoke through signs and hieroglyphs. And the key to Tarot corresponds with the letters of the Hebraic alphabet. Still, he emphasized intuition. And this is whatever we do, it doesn't matter if it's astrology or if we study the scriptures or if we use tarot cards all the time. We have to develop our intuition. We have to learn to trust our intuition. But there are keys that can set our minds in motion, and they are helpful. Absolutely. Now, I don't want to spend much time here, but I have this book, right? And I picked the number 9 because number 9 is the hermit. And you see how he does it. So he puts the letter on the one side and then interpretation of the card, the tarot card. This is like the number 9, a major arcana. You see here the cloak, which presents self-reliance, and the lamp, the illuminated mind. And then in the following pages, he gives his interpretations and explains what he means and how he interprets it. And in that book, actually, I just want to point that out. It's interesting because they're not only, he doesn't only connect the Kabbalah with the Tarot, but he there are lots of drawings in there. He was really incredibly creative, this man. Now, there are biographers or occultists who say this is far-fetched, right? But there are others who completely agree with him. And our Richard Smalley, who is the editor of the Quest magazine and has written many books and is incredibly knowledgeable, he also developed a course for the National Lodge about the Tarot. And I think in lesson 4, he said, well, the whole system might go even further back. It might have to do with geometry and with math. And so I'm just providing some examples so you can see these connections, right? So number 9 is the number of initiation by Hermes. But the number 9 symbolizes divine completeness. It conveys the meaning of finality in Christianity. Christ dies in the 9th hour. 9 represents the fruits of God's Holy Spirit, which are faithfulness, gentleness, goodness, joy, kindness, long-suffering, love, peace, and self-control. Now, the number 9 is revered in Hinduism and considered a complete, perfected, and divine number because it represents the end of a cycle in the decimal system, which originated from the Indian subcontinent as early as 3000 BC. Numerologists, they understand that the number 9 holds an exceptionally wise spiritual energy. It contains every other number that has come before it. If you add up 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 1 and so on plus 9, it gives 45. And that 4 plus 5 gives 9. So symbolically, the number 9 is the container for all worldly experiences. And according to numerology, number 9 represents initiation and wisdom. I love to do that. I love to compare different traditions and different teachers, and I always try to find the overlap. This brings us to probably the most famous esoteric drawing, Baphomet, which has been abused and misused for decades. So Manly Hall says that for him it's a composite creature formulated to symbolize the astral light. And he was the only one. But then I also found there's a man called Julian Strube, and he wrote a dissertation about Éliphas Lévi. But he focused more on the political and socialist part of his personality. But he did write an article about, so the dissertation is in German, was never translated, but he wrote 2 articles in English. And he also said the same thing. It symbolizes the Astral Light. Anyhow, let's look at it. You can see here, it's both male, female. It's an androgynous figure. You can see here the serpents and the caduceus. You see here the bird-like wings, which are half open. You see the right arm going upwards and the left arm down. You see a pentagram on the forehead. 2 large horns rise from either side. And then, I hope you can see this here, there's a horn with a flaming spout, that flaming intelligence in Levi's word. So let's look at it again. So here we have man in the universe is intermediate between matter and spirit. So look at it. He sits on the globe, right? And he reaches to heaven. So arms are correspondence of higher and lower worlds. The pentagram is man's spiritual dominion over nature, over matter. The goat has always been a fertility symbol. It also shows the animal nature, right? We have the desire body, the lower mind, the animal nature. But then we have the desire to go develop, to evolve and get rid of our animal nature. Let's put it simply. The angel's wings are the possibility of rising above the material. And I don't know how to say it, Caduceus serpents, it's the unitary creative principle. It's the reconciliation of apparent opposites. So, how does Levi explain the significance of this image? He says, it's a pantheistic and magical figure of the absolute. The torch placed between the 2 horns represents the equilibrating intelligence of the triad. The goat's head, which is sympathetic, and unites some characteristics of the dog, bull, and ass, represents the exclusive responsibility of matter and the expiation of bodily sins in the body. The hands are human to exhibit the sanctity of labor. They make the signs of esotericism above and below to impress mystery on initiates, and they point at 2 lunar crescents, the upper being white and the lower black, to explain the correspondences of good and evil, mercy and justice. So, what is the meaning? It represents the totality of existence and the unification of opposites, such as masculinity and femininity, day and night, as a divine whole. It has nothing whatsoever to do with the biblical Satan. And just to point this out, because I find this so important, Levi says Satan is a superior personality and force doesn't exist. It's malicious intentions of misled personas. It's always about polarity, right? Trying to find the middle, find the equilibrium. There is a lot to cover with Éliphas Lévi, and I tried my best to pull out the topics that are important for Theosophists and that were important to me personally. I hope you got a feeling for who this person is, and also why I am so impressed with this truth to himself. Because it cannot have been easy. He was educated for 15 years and he had to give that up because of his inner voice telling him this is not the right path. It might have been his path of initiation. And I think at the beginning, he just didn't even know where he was going, right? He just listened to his inner voice, and then things happened and brought him to the right path. And when you read about him, you feel this peacefulness, this calm that he has inside of him at the end of his life. he was not afraid of death. I mean, he lived. He found his dharma, and might be surprised that so many people have written about him, and we are still talking about him in 2021. One thing, when I am not clear about something, then I take a drawing. There's, for example, one with two triangles, right? I didn't find one that I thought was in the public domain, and the triangles touch each other, and then the upper one is bright and light. There's light in there, and there's happiness, and you can. There are different interpretations. At the bottom is dark, and it's like the face. It looks like it's horrified, and I feel it's like when I meditated on it, it's like a guidance. It's like, what do you want out of your life? Is this what are you going to be true yourself? Are you going to live and find the light? Or are you going to live in fear what other people think, in fear that you might be poor like he did, or, just do what somebody else tells you to do. And he didn't do that. He followed his intuition. He went on the right, for me, on the path. And that's what I learned from him, that he took the steps that were necessary. And he was courageous in that. And he did write about Paracelsus. And Paracelsus is the one we're going to talk about next week. He's an imposing magical authority. No one has accomplished works greater than his. He also said his successes were incredible, for never has any physician approached Paracelsus in his marvels of healing. And the sad thing is, so many people who are not interested in occultism don't even know who Paracelsus is. And the light is the quintessence of Paracelsus. Light astralized in the stars, animalized in animals, humanized in human beings. Light which vegetates in plants, glistens in metals, produces all forms of nature, and equilibrates all by the laws of universal sympathy. So I hope you will join me again next week for that talk.